Good afternoon. Welcome. Bienvenidos. We're so excited to have you all here. My name is Fat Mandy, and my co-host Shay M. Lawson Esquire and I are the co-chairs of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the Songwriters of North America. This is our third in a series of fireside chats that we've been having. This month, we are thrilled to be joined for Hispanic Heritage Month by the artist Jesaiah and our wonderful director of conversation, Liana Maneese. A little bit about our guest artist. Jesaiah is an independent Mexican Jewish American artist, and she was first discovered on American Idol season 12. Her Hebrew name, Jesaiah, was given to her by her Jewish father and her Mexican mother. She was born into a family of artists, most notably Ramon Navarro Samaniego, and he worked as an actor and a singer, and he was actually the first Latin American star in all of Hollywood during the silent film era. Currently, wow. Jesaiah, yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
Like the very first, like numero uno.
Numero uno.
Jesaiah currently works as a singer and a producer, and she's creating wonderful music alongside Grammy award-winning writers, and she's been gaining a lot of attention for her unique multicultural sound and artistry. And if you have tuned in before, you are familiar with our wonderful Liana Maneese, but if you are new here, please welcome Brazilian-born, Pittsburgh-raised Liana Maneese. She is an award-winning activist, visionary entrepreneur, doula, and a catalyst for creative engagement. She is the co-founder of the Good People's Group, which provides deep, purposeful, and intentional small group consulting focused on individual growth, social justice, and historical multidisciplinary learning to create safe and equitable spaces. Her background includes degrees in cultural studies and clinical mental health applied psychology. So with that said, I think Shay and I are going to turn it over to Jesaiah and Liana, and we're going to have an incredible conversation about Hispanic Heritage Month and living and working in the music industry.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Jesaiah. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Ooh, this is so cool. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Yeah, it's so interesting. I was so excited because I think about Hispanic Heritage Month. Also, some people say it's like, is it Latin American? Is it Hispanic? Like who knows? It's interesting because I think my country is not Spanish speaking, so I don't technically fall into the Hispanic Heritage Month category, which I think might be an important thing to note. So when we think about the word Hispanic, which we'll talk about how people feel about the word, but it is like Spanish speaking in America. And so it is like, it's not everybody in Latin America. And so just a little tiny random piece of information today.
Well, it's kind of one of those things, like, for example, when you say you're Jewish, it's kind of a misconstrued idea of, okay, are you Jewish ethnically or you're Jewish religion? So, I mean, Brazil, right? They speak Portuguese. You got people in the Latin industry like Anita, who is literally taking over the industry with music, multi-languages. So,
yes,
Latina, okay?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, right now there's a huge explosion, just like you're mentioning, of like diverse genres in terms of language specifically. Do you feel like these, I guess we could call them subgenres, are useful, helpful, harmful? How are you feeling about that?
Absolutely 100% useful, especially for how society is pushing to coming together as a more equal, universal place. I mean, you always hear people talking about future babies, like in 100 years, future babies, and we might not have redheads anymore, which is crazy, but universally, music is something that everyone can understand regardless of the language. But the way music industry is taking multi-languages like Spanglish or Portuguese and Spanish or Spanish and English in music modern, what it's doing is not only getting the listeners to be more open to other cultures, it's getting society to push back that division that we've had for so long.
Yeah, I love that. It's like when you're in it, you know, when you have this very sort of multicultural perspective, you know, it's stuff that we don't really think about. We kind of integrate these different layers of our identities and our families' identities in a much more natural way. And we forget that, like, the way, you know, just society as a whole sees us is much more complicated, I think, sometimes than we see ourselves.
I feel like, you know, we're in that transition period where people, for example, if you're grown out here, but your lineage goes way back to Brazil or Mexico or Argentina or anywhere, you're constantly searching for that missing part of you. But since we're
Yes.
in the transition period, I feel like a lot of people are really coming into their own in this moment of
Yes.
seeing everything.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It feels
Mhm.
like language and nationality are heavily, I guess, focused on when it comes to determining where you're from and where you fit into, you know, Latinx culture. Like, you know, we focus a lot on those pieces of who we are. But how can those boundaries be broken down? How do you think that this new generation is really breaking down those barriers in more specific ways?
Well, I mean, since we're on the topic of music, music is a huge benefactor for this. This is like, I think it's one of the number one ways that we are breaking these categories and these boxes that people feel like, oh, am I this or am I this? Because naturally, I don't know what it is, but society is always trying to categorize things by default sometimes because we're trying to rationalize certain things about, we're trying to
Yes.
um, right? Do you understand what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think it's a setup to do that. I think we're like really expected to do that. We have to create these like binary oppositions. Like, you're this, I'm that, you know, it's like we determine who we are based on what other people are or are not.
And it's okay to be proud to be certain things as well as open to everything. And some
Mm-hmm.
caught up, they're like, oh, I'm this and I'm this, but then you have this certain category of people who are like, oh, but you're not this, we're this, and you know, it's like football.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
we're playing teams, which it's exciting. But at the end of the day, when you're at a baseball game and there's two teams playing against each other, at the end of the game, everyone shakes hands saying, good game,
Mm-hmm.
good game. What we're seeing culturally, which is, it's amazing. It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. It is beautiful. I really love the direction that things are headed in. You know, I remember thinking, you know, I was reading an article, it was many, many, many years ago, and I study interracial relationships in a very specific way. And I remember reading about how, you know, this country was not going to be white by the year, you know, we were like, people of color, Black and brown people, Indigenous people, we're going to completely, you know, tip the scales it back into our favor. I think it was about, initially when this was written, it was like by 2040 or something like that. And now it's like even sooner. It's speeding up. It's speeding up every time I'm reading about it. It's like now. It's like it's happening now. And I'm really curious to see how this changes our country, and if it'll change our country, and if so, you know, what that means. And I think, you know, speaking to young people, I will say, a young person, I'm definitely not in the same category age-wise as you are. It gives me great, great hope and excitement for the direction that we're headed in.
I mean, just think about it. When the schools are teaching things in history books, they're going to be teaching about the past of intersectionality, and because it's not going to exist anymore. I feel like we're just going to be one giant mesh pot of origins and history, and we can be proud of those stories, but ultimately those boxes aren't going to exist anymore at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Like, very indigenous, untouched, untapped territories where, you know, there's is a very
Mm-hmm.
untouched spot from
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like what you're saying is interesting too, because it makes you think about what's needed. It's like we're obviously already all of those things, but it's like we have these expectations to fit into these categories, not necessarily for ourselves. Like, we already have things laid out in terms of who we are and who we know we are, but just that need to do it, to define it in sort of this within our society, you know, that's like, no, you need to be, you know, white, you need to be Asian, you need to be Black, and you can only fit into these, you know, 3 boxes or 4 boxes. And, you know, we know that it's much more complicated. We know intersectionally we're all made of so many pieces, you know.
And I think people ultimately, what we're wanting is just to be understood. At the end of the day, that's what everyone wants, is to be understood and embraced and just accepted. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot
Yeah.
that's being accepted, especially in the music industry. I mean, we, I mean, it, I mean, gosh, like 4 or 5 years ago, never in my life would I have thought that I would be prioritizing and also being more heavily involved in the Latino community, which, you know, my mom's Mexicana de Sonora and my father is Jewish, but I was raised down here. So it was very hard to embrace my Latina culture. Um, I was raised. I mean, we had cholas and cowboys. That's pretty much where I was.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
other,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes so much back to this idea of like what it's like in America, there is such a focus on language, when the truth is like, you know, I was adopted from Brazil, so I didn't learn Portuguese. And so it was very hard, you know, growing up and being like, I'm Brazilian. No one called me Brazilian. They would call me Latina, but they would never call me Brazilian, and they never called me Black, which is a whole nother story. But it's just so fascinating to always be sort of stuck in this place where, you know, we have these certain markers that define us. And, you know, if you don't speak Spanish or you don't speak Portuguese, then you don't get to be part of this group, which is just ridiculous, you know. But it's something I think growing up that a lot of kids, especially in the United States, deal with.
I mean, during the time of immigration for over the last 100 years, more, I mean, definitely more. But as of the last 100 years, I think our family members at the time, because it was different, they wanted us to blend in. I didn't learn Spanish growing up at all. It was something I started learning 4 or 5 years ago. And it was struggle. It was such a struggle. And I felt like, why am I a poser for doing Latin music? I'm not even a fluent speaker. They're never going to accept me. You know, these are all things that mixed people like ourselves go through every day.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, even just like the word mixed, like I've heard so many different perspectives on the language. You know, when I grew up, that's what everybody called anybody that was, you know, not just fitting in that white or Black box. You know, it was like anybody in between. And I'm here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just for anybody, you know, wondering. And you're in Los Angeles, right? You know, so I moved to Los Angeles in college, and it was culture shock. You know, I didn't see people that looked like me, or kind of in Pittsburgh. I'm a very considered very ambiguous person, you know. And it's changing a lot now, but it looked very different then. And so going to California, it was like, and Los Angeles specifically, I was like, this is wild. Everybody is just all over the place. And I remember just being very struck, like, you know, like nobody's looking at me weird. Nobody, you know, it was just like, it was such a different, much more exciting feeling and experience for me. So, you know, thinking about that and thinking about, you know, your experience as someone that has this, you know, multicultural identity, and someone, you know, you've been on American Idol, like, wow, that's so cool. As someone who just like watches American Idol, and here I am like talking to somebody who had that very big experience, you know. You had a recent movie premiere, right? You're involved in the Latin Grammys. Yes, it's so exciting. Involved in the Latin Grammys. But you've also talked about this imposter syndrome, and that feeling of not being enough, you know. And, you know, what roles do you think that this sort of cultural hierarchy, like we're talking about, this cultural hierarchy of, you know, language, of the sexualization of Latino women, and just the overall dichotomy of being like colonized, you know, this conquered to be conquered. How does all of this play together, you know, in terms of how you're navigating your identity as a songwriter?
Yeah.
Who wants to raise the bar, you know, who wants us to do better?
Right. Well, you know, imposter syndrome, I'm not gonna lie, regardless on the I mean, I just did the movie, right? It's completely in Spanish. One was one of the most, I think the most absurd things I ever tried to do. I'm like, oh, there's a movie. I'm hungry. I'm gonna go for it. I didn't understand the majority of things that were being said on
Yeah.
set. It was very, there's this sort of feeling of not being able to understand fully. You want so desperately to be a part of it. And watching that movie was a very surreal experience because I'm like, whoa, here's this person on the screen.
Yeah.
She's speaking Spanish. I didn't even realize I didn't speak Spanish when watching the movie, and nor did anyone else in the crowd. And it kind of helped with the validation, like, okay, maybe this imposter syndrome is just, it's a myth, you know, there's no
Yeah.
imposter syndrome. It's all this game that we play in our brains, you know?
Yes.
And
I agree.
it's just, you know, this whole journey's been incredible. And I do sometimes have that moments of doubt every once in a while, maybe once a week. No, I'm just kidding. Once a week. I'm like, am I really doing this? But like, you keep getting signs. And ultimately, I want to say this, shout out to the Latino community, because their doors are so wide open. I mean, there's definitely times where you feel like, oh, I can't relate. But at the same time, the Latino community is such a beautiful community, and it's amazing that we're celebrating Hispanic heritage in this month because they are such an open people. They're so accepting in a lot of different ways. And it was one of my biggest fears going into this. And I want to give a big shout out to my Latinos out there because it is a beautiful community that's ultimately taking over the music industry right now, you know? We sing back number one, Anita, Carol G, Becky G. Becky G didn't even speak fluent Spanish. You know, she's an LA raised girl. You know, she's from the West Coast. She didn't learn Spanish. You got Snow the Product, right? She wasn't born into her culture. And also an amazing representation of this bilingual culture, this some people don't like the word Latinx. I don't feel anything about it, but I mean, I think it might simplify the fact that we have a lot of Latino people growing out here. So there's this subgenre of Latinas and Latinos out here, and we represent that small. How would you call it? What would you call it? We represent this community that hasn't really been represented as much in history because it is a new thing. It is beautiful. And
well, I think like you said something earlier about, you know, when we were talking about our parents and just sort of like the assimilation that so many of us went through to just kind of our parents went through it. And then, you know, we had these expectations put on us, and some people didn't, and some people did and fought back and said, like, no, I'm doing my own thing. I know you think it's safer for me to, you know, speak a certain way, look a certain way, do my hair a certain way, dress a certain way, whatever, right? But no, I'm going to lean into who I am and lean into that culture, you know, more, you know. And I think it's that, I always call it in between the middle. You know, I always think about it as this, like, we're in between the middle, like we get to this point in history. There's so many layers to us, and we're just kind of in this, we're in between, and then we're in between again. And it's like, and then we're trying to get out, like, hey, I know that this is very complicated for everybody to understand, but you can do it. You know, there's lots of intersections, and I'm still a whole person with all of these pieces, and you must accept all of them. You know, and that's how we're going to make this work, you know.
At this point in our time, what we're living through is we are breaking generational confusion of not feeling like we are accepted in either or section, because it's a very interesting, like, being a mixed person, you're the blood of the conquered and the blood of the conqueror, and that is a confusing thing, but it's also empowering. Okay, like we have the blood of people who fought for survival on both ends, and although there's a lot of things that we might disagree with as far as like being conquered, we're part of the conquerors. How do we feel about that? That's like a struggle. I'm like, how do I feel about being part of the blood of the conquerors and the people who've taken over a certain indigenous place? And how do I feel about being the last of the indigenous history of our people? You know, it's that up and down. It's like angel and devil on your shoulder being like, this is great, this is not. And ultimately, where do we go from there? Like, what do you think about being blood of the conquered and the conqueror, you know?
Mm-hmm. So I think about it a lot. Oh my gosh, it's probably like the most major thing that I've thought of, especially as an adoptee, because you have to remember too, like I have no idea who my birth parents are at all. Zero. So I didn't know anything about my identity besides just the way I looked until I took a DNA test, which was actually not very long ago. It was probably in 2018 or something like that. Maybe 2018, 2019. I had no clue. And that's when I found out that it was like very, very much exactly what you're saying. Like most Brazilians are in that boat, right? Most of us are in that boat where it's like, 40, 50% Portuguese and 40, 50% Black, and then there's like whatever else, 10, 20% floating around in indigenous, whatever, right? In other pieces of identity around there and in these different intersections. But it was, I figured that was what it was gonna be, but it was so weird to kind of be like, I have no idea who I am, and I'm in my 30s, and here I am, like just like seeing it on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
It's very weird. And then you do have to like sit with that. Like, I think what for me, what I had to remember and what I really hold on to is what Black writers particularly have really, historically have really taught us about what it means, like that none of us are really mixed, that we are still like, we have been those pieces of us that were kind of sought to be killed, really, right? Like that side of us that was really like, I want to extinct the other side of you, like that's intense. That's intense, navigating, which is why I've devoted my whole life to exploring this. But like, and you're doing the same thing in a lot of ways in your own identity and your own music, right? That exploring of like, what do you do? And I think for me, moving from a place of thinking of myself in this very mixed way to moving to myself being, a very whole person, I'm not like I'm not, what do people say? You're a big melting pot. They always, compare it to like a big food mixture. And I'm just like, I am not a food mixture. I am like very much a person from people who have suffered, and so I get to choose what I claim. I like to think about it that way. I get to choose the pieces of myself. I get to choose the ancestors. I get to choose who's looking after me and who's not. And so I kind of think about it like that. I think about what do I want to own and how about myself, about what I know, which is going to be different for everybody. And how do I let that rule my integrity and my intention moving forward, And I think music for me has been a huge way for me to navigate that. I mean, the arts in general, music, writing, all of that. I mean, that's what I've turned to understand myself, as I'm sure so many other people do, because there's a lot of pain that comes from not knowing pieces of ourselves, whichever side of that you fall on. You said something earlier that I thought was a really impactful way to say it, something, I think you said like people not born into their culture. And as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, because it's like, that's most of us, right? Like that is so many of us now, especially in America, we are not born into our culture and that is a painful place, also, like you mentioned, exciting. So very painful and also very exciting because you can influence it. So what are some of the ways that you feel excited just to influence the culture as we're moving forward here?
Well, ultimately, and again, what you just said was awesome. I mean, it really does come down to just that certain contentment and peace going forward, and even forgiveness to yourself, even though you didn't do nothing.
Yeah.
You didn't do nothing, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of as far as moving forward in this industry, in this world, in the way that we walk, in the way that we are, forgiveness is key. Even if it's no one specific, it's truly what is part of the transitional period right now. And what I feel like in music in this very moment, especially for myself, the way that I want to affect the universe, the way I want to affect people, is I want to blur the lines of cultural division. And a lot of us are doing that right now. We're breaking boundaries. We're breaking what is like the normal. Like I said, I never in my life would have thought I'd be speaking Spanish in a movie or singing in Spanish. I didn't speak Spanish growing up. My grandma, she spoke Spanish. I didn't usually understand her unless she was like cussing at us or something, and running with us, running after us with the chocolate, like, because we were. But that's what I'm doing at the moment, is I'm implementing the culture of my Jewish heritage, my Mexican heritage, and reaching out to my ancestors to help me empower this movement of diversity and how we can be so culturally universal. Ramon Navarro, he was the very first, which is insane.
Amazing.
Like he was back in the 1920s, he was one of the very few actors and singers who made it from the silent era to the voice era. And him and Rudolph Valentino were seen as like the Latin lovers. That was the fad at the time. And, he traveled from Spain. He was from Durango, Mexico. His family was from Mexico. And he came out here as a gay man, as a gay man in early Hollywood history. And he pushed past all these barriers of his act, of his culture, of his sexuality, and he made it. And Hollywood protected him back in that time because it was very different back then, obviously. And seeing his story and seeing many stories of the past of people who fought for us to be here today gives me, and I hopefully the rest of our community, the confidence to just keep going. Imposter syndrome. Mix as much of your culture within your music or your art or your career as much as you would like, because ultimately it's your signature. It's, what's smaller than an atom is a sound wave. So when you are bringing sound into the world, energy cannot be destroyed. You are literally creating life. And that or that movie or that piece of work is going to outlive you. So just keep making what you want to make.
I love that. I think we only have a few more minutes, and there's something that I really wanted to, touch on. Because, you were saying, that you mentioned the word protection, Hollywood sort of like protecting this identity that felt very different at the time. They weren't really sure how to navigate it. And though Hollywood may have been protective, I'm sure there's lots of spaces that probably not. And so it makes me think about, what are, I when I was growing up, there was such an intense, you could see it anywhere, in magazines, on TV, in the music industry, everywhere, just an intense over sexualization, especially of young women, but women of color in general, and it can be a very scary, as we've seen, in lots of different ways, scary place to kind of navigate in, the music industry, but really just like the industry, all of these industries that seem to have their own rules, right? Like they're not operating, arguably, no one is, right? Doesn't matter whether you're corporate America or in the music industry, women are still being over sexualized. But how do you, I guess in a way, like how are you keeping yourself safe in these spaces? Like how are you navigating, like, yep, definitely, I trust you, I should go there, that's cool. Like, yes, like I'm alone in this place with this person. How do you do this? Like, it seems really daunting to me,
I will say this, being a woman in an industry that is very imaginative is it's a struggle. And I'm sure whoever's listening, if you're an artist and you're female, or you're a producer and you're a female, just being female in general is so difficult, guys. um, what we have to experience even anatomically, but in regards to seeking equality as your counterparts or your collaborators, it is definitely a struggle. And you're right, there is a hypersexualization of women in music, okay? And in the Latin culture, there's two sections. There's the, I don't want to over sexualize myself and be the Latina hot mommy on the show. And then you got the other ones where like, I'm embracing the hot Latina mommy vibe, right? Okay, so you got two different people, right? The two different types of musicians, artists. And
like
then
architect.
yes, and then you have this middle point. You have the men in this middle section, right? And the thing is, you always want to be true and transparent to yourself. You don't have to act like a Latina hot mommy if you're just like a songwriter, a storyteller talking about the sensuality of love, compared to the club, like, I'm gonna shake my butt on, like, I'm not gonna say anything raunchy, but you know, you've heard a lot of these lyrics in Spanish, and it can be extreme on one end and it can also be beautifully extreme on the other end. And I think that's why men and women are embracing Peso Pluma, for example, because he's bringing back that beautiful, pure lyrical energy when it comes to romanticizing love. And in this era of like, you know, I'm not gonna say what I'm saying. And as a woman, it's very difficult to decide whether you want to fall into one place or another. And a lot of women do feel pressured. You know, when I walk into a studio, sometimes there's definitely been times where people are like, okay, all right, but who's the real audio engineer? I'm like, no, I've recorded this. Oh, no. But like, who did your vocals? Or I'm like, I recorded this at home, you know? And a lot of women in the industry have to deal with that. But luckily, there's more representation for female as producers and just creatives in general. And so I'm hoping, which I feel like it is working slowly but surely, when you walk into a room as a female, whether you're an artist, a producer, a writer, your counterparts, your collaborators will see you as equal. And there'll be times where they don't, but you always got to put your foot forward and obviously leave your ego at the door, and not say in an aggressive way, but let people know where you are, and expect equality when it comes to the work field.
Yeah. And it's like, I think so much of it is just like demand. Like we are, you know, we're just, it's like not very long. Like we're still dealing with this stuff. So it's like, we have to just get to this place where it's like, it's not an option. It's not an option. You are going to, this is how it's going to be, you know? And that's terrifying, right? It's terrifying, you know, it's risky, you know, but I think like there is this layer of, you know, we, like it's always been, of protecting ourselves, you know, sticking together and hoping that there's more of us in the room, and it just becomes more and more and more comfortable as we move forward, trying to navigate this wild society that we live in.
Mama on speed dial, be like, hey, can you call me? You know, just text and be like, hey, can you call me? You know, just we're working on it. That's all I gotta say.
Yeah, we're working on it. That's all I gotta say too. I think that, and that's like the permanent state, and it's like, it's that we're always going to have to do that, and that's okay. You know, it's a commitment. It's part of our value system, and you know, we're gonna keep moving together. So I think now it's probably time to open it up to some audience dialogue. So let's see if Shay and Mandy have any questions for us here.
We are here. Thank you both so much. This has been a really, really great conversation so far. And so we do have questions from our audience. We have Sandor, who is in the chat and said, sometimes we have to discover our heritage later in life. How did you go about learning Spanish as an adult?
Yes, great question.
Wow. Okay. for one, yes, learning anything as far as a language goes, or just is very difficult, especially when you're not a little baby with the sponge brain. I feel like it's a lot harder to absorb things and let seep and marinate and stay. One of the things that I did in order to learn Spanish was listening to telenovelas.
Yeah.
Telenovelas, listening to music, talking with my grandma more because she speaks Spanish, and being able to be in a community. And even though you might sound like Baby Yoda trying to speak it, you know, the fact that you're trying is super admirable. And I know it can be embarrassing sometimes when you're at an event and you're trying to speak Spanish and you sound like a 5-year-old, because I've been told I sound like a 5-year-old in the past, but they thought it was cute. So just you know, because they know you're trying to learn. They appreciate the fact that you are trying to be a part of your culture.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I love that appreciated feeling, like you're appreciating like where you're from. I've found it to be extremely terrifying to learn Portuguese. I like extremely. And my mother didn't speak it. You know, I was adopted, and she moved to Brazil, and she actually said the exact same thing. She used to watch the soap operas in Brazil, and that's how she would, you know, soak it all in. So I think that's like a huge, awesome piece of advice, because you really need to hear it. And if you're not actually where people are talking in that language all the time, you know, you have to keep your brain open to it. You really have to be around it. And that can be very, very challenging.
Absolutely.
I also think it's the point of trying, even though you know it won't be perfect and you know you probably
Doing
sound
it anyway.
crazy, and they acknowledge you sound crazy. It's also the appreciating that you tried. And I think that's across cultures, where instead of walking in and expecting everyone to speak English and meet you where you are, that you're taking the step to, you know, meet across barriers. And so I think that that's really great, even though it is very hard to learn a language. As
And
an adult.
It's way okay to mess up. I literally said the most hilarious messed up thing on a live radio station in Peru once. And they thought it was hilarious. They captioned the episode off of what I said because it was so messed up in a funny way. It was
Tell us the story. No, we're here now. Tell us the story. Tell us the story.
They were asking me, oh my gosh, they were asking me what I liked about Peru, right? Because I was there for to record some music videos. And I was like, oh, I love the food. And they're like, have you tried pisco sour? And I'm like, sí, muy borracha, muy fuego. What did I say? Very, so fuego, pero so borracho. And they thought it was hilarious. It was, which means it's so fire, but so drunk. And they named the episode "Quién es?" who is so borracho, so fuego, so borracho, who fire, so drunk. And it's those that really makes you feel okay. You know, it was hilarious. It's okay to mess up, and people love you for it. You know.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
That's such a good story. Okay, we have our second question in the chat, and it says, it's also from Sandora. It says, you've also done a lot of traveling to Latin America during the last few years. How was that? Speaking of Peru, how have your travels been? How have you been received? Any other funny stories for us?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So fire, so drunk. Oh gosh, okay, yes. Peru is definitely a hot spot. I loved going there. I went there twice. Working with the people there was absolutely amazing. But one of the things I did realize when traveling to Costa Rica or Mexico or Peru, any of Latin America, was when you travel and you're from the US, you have this sort of existential crisis, realizing, oh my God, I've been living in a bubble my whole life.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm talking
yes,
about?
Same thing, same experience.
Where I went there and I'm like, whoa, the education system's different here. The way people interact is different. The community's different. the air is different, the water's different, the fruit is different. Everything is not as it seems. It's like you have a moment of, have I been living in a simulation my whole life?
Yes. Yes, we have.
We haven't been taught. A lot of people here don't even use WhatsApp in the US, but that's my main source of communication, because everyone around the world uses WhatsApp.
Yep.
You know, not a lot of people use iMessage in every place because not everyone has iPhones or the same sort of popular network. So yes, you're gonna burst the bubble traveling, and it's gonna be amazing. And there's so many beautiful takeaways from every single place, and that you can really embrace and hopefully implement in your life here in the US.
Yes.
We have a question from Flavia that says, while writing a song, how do you translate from English to Spanish? Because I know it's not always in an equivalent phrasing.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's a good question. Well, I think one of the most important things is, what do you want to say? What is a story? And a story and the message can be told in very few words. People like to explain and hyper explain a lot of things, and it can be poetic, it can be kind of encrypted, a message. But one of my ways to get through creating and translating is creating a very specific message and being able to reiterate it in a more simplistic manner. So I usually start with melodies and a concept first. I start to fill in the words of English and Spanish. I'm like, okay, what do I know in English? What do I know in Spanish? Okay, how can I use a more eloquent, how can I say it more eloquently within the Spanish language, but simple? Because like I said, one of the biggest issues with language is when you're not born into it, if you aren't grown with it, there's a lot of slang, there's a lot of things that you don't know, and you can maybe come off as generic when translating things into Spanish. So what I love to do is have a little yellow Webster dictionary, right? And it's in Spanish and English. And I'm just like, okay, higher power, God, whoever you want to believe in, I believe in God. What am I going to say today? I flip the pages, I put my finger, and I find this really beautiful word. And like, okay, how can we expand off of it?
Oh, I love it. That's so romantic.
Yes.
Yeah. I just like the love of just like, I think part of this is that's so cool about you is just like really focusing on this, like, this is how we communicate, like this, it's not as much like specifically what you're saying as much as like the energy that's behind it.
Absolutely.
And just appreciation of like, I'm gonna get it as right as I can, but just trusting that it's the energy behind it that's gonna create that connection. I love it.
Yeah.
It feels much more accessible. It's making language feel more accessible.
And filling in the words, with Spanglish, it's, you can have a conversation with someone who speaks mainly Spanish, and you're filling in the words you don't know in English, and then eventually when it's the language barrier, you just, okay, now it's 50% English, 50% Spanish. Okay, now it's 60% Spanish and 40% English, and eventually any language,
Yes.
I think
awesome.
Mandy has a question for you.
Yeah, I'm loving this conversation. Thank you so much for doing this with us. So I had a question that we talked a little bit about in our pre-planning session. I find it really exciting how you're exploring both your Jewish and your Hispanic heritage. But you told us about a famous older ancestor, I think, who composed Sephardic music, which, that music was made, when cultures were getting along, when Jews and Arabs and Muslims and Christians were all living together, making what is considered one of the best languages to write poetry and music in, So I don't know if you would tell us a little bit about, you know, that ancestor, what you know about him, but I think it's exciting that you have like this lovely family lineage of exciting composers and artists.
Absolutely. And you know what it is? I don't know if it was Sephardic. My father is Sephardic, but I had an ancestor in, I believe, the, gosh, 17th, 18th century. I don't want to misquote, but they're from Spain. And my family stems part of it from the Samaniego village, northern Spain. One of the ancestors recorded was a composer for orchestral music, like classical arrangements. So I don't believe it was in Hebrew or anything like that. I believe it may have been in Spanish or early Spanish mix with Latin, like Latin, you know. But it is very interesting because on the Jewish side of things, you know, it it's so mixed up. You know, we're so mixed. Jews are so confused too. There is confusion with Latinas too. Like I'm
Trust
like,
me, I know. I can attest to that one. Yes, yes, we are. Yes, yes.
we're the whole ball of confusion. So it just goes back to your compassion and your passion for investigating your history and taking pieces of it. Since I was a little girl, I always was drawn to people like Shakira or those Middle Eastern sounding mixes. And Shakira's Colombian, and what is she? No,
There's a big belly dance community in Colombia. And if you listen to the rhythms, like the Ayub, don't get, sounds just like a cumbia beat.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like the same. It's the wildest thing. Sorry.
right. And she's one of those stars that really started to implement that Middle Eastern and Latin heritage and making it super spicy into this world. And
She's Lebanese. It's Lebanese and Colombian.
okay, cool. Thank you. Because I couldn't, I was like, I don't know what, you know, we're all neighbors, you know, at the end of the day. But yeah, it's just going back down to history, it feels natural to reach out to some like really indigenous sounds. And I think a lot of people who are mixed really are tending to explore that area of music right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to hop in and ask a music advocacy question. SONA is obviously an advocacy organization for songwriters fighting for fair pay. And you talked a little bit about equality from the sense of like gender equality. But can you talk a little bit about just one of the main things that SONA focuses on, which is pay equality? Have you experienced in working in the industry, a difference in the pay that you receive across genres, whether you're doing Spanish language or English speaking, and how groups like SONA or songwriters generally can kind of advocate for the Spanish speaking music community?
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Absolutely. Girl, you with your questions, Shay, you're like, the sky is blue, you know, your questions are like super, I love it. Okay. So SONA is, I think it's one of the first times, because when I went to ASCAP, gosh, maybe 8, 9 years ago, and that's when they had the small booth. It was just starting. It was just a few ladies on deck, and I didn't know what this was, but I joined, and it's one of the most important things, in my opinion, happening to the politics of music history right now. They're quite literally changing history before us. And the community has expanded since 8, 9 years ago so much. So many big players, so many big writers, influencers in the music industry, lawyers. I mean, SONA has already changed so much. And when they go to the White House, when they're trying to get bills passed, when they're trying to advocate for health, mental health, insurance, health insurance, you know, it's our music rule book is over hundreds and years old, right? And like, it needs to be changed. There's a lot of things that are really outdated that make absolutely no sense at this point. And is one of the number one places that is generally changing all of these things for equality, for getting paid on time. Come on, you know, for really stepping up and going up in the faces of the people. We're not going to name names, but going up to the places that we're like, hey, this isn't fair. How do you expect these people to even survive and make you this music? How do you expect these people to create and continue creating for you guys if they can't even afford healthcare, if they can't even get paid on time, or if ever? You know, there's a lot of speculation with music, and that's the issue. There needs to be more written agreements when it comes to getting equality in your music and what you're rightfully owed, especially they get the bottom of the bucket, and yet they're the ones who are creating the music that the corporations are making so much money off of. Where is that? And so, sorry, I'm on a rant. I just really supportive of SONA, and like, you know, it's to be a rebel in music is to be SONA, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think everyone who wants to get paid on time, who wants to get paid equally, who wants to get respected as an equal in the music industry should join SONA in order to preach and protest the things that have been so unjust for our community.
Wow, there's our call to action. I don't need to say anything in the end.
I
There
know.
it was.
Mic
Chop
drop.
it up. Let's put this on the website. That was a commercial. No, I'm kidding. Thank you. I thank you for that. But I want to circle back on it again, because we've talked about this a little bit. We've worked a bit across some publishing and some PROs, and they've talked to us a little bit about the differences in the economics of how songs are paid out and how kind of money works in the Latin music space. Have you experienced that yourself at all, where you said, okay, well, I did this, you know, maybe a pop thing over here and this is how it paid out, but I did a Latin thing over here and this is how it paid out? Have you seen any differences across genres?
Well, I will say this in general, it's very difficult to make stable income in music for any independent artists, or just in general when it comes to pop music. Or when I say pop, I mean Latin music too. I mean all the genres that you listen to on the radio. There's a lot higher stability in approaching music genres such as cinematics or TV and ink. It's a lot easier to get paid on time, respectfully, in cinematic music or TV placements or commercial placements. It's more of the corporate side of music that people don't investigate as much, especially as young aspiring artists. But think about it like this, you know, you're an indie artist, you're coming to town, you want to make it big, but you also want to pay your rent, right? Write music and also pitch it to licensing, you know, getting it licensed, or on a TV show. Say you have like one of your favorite songs as an artist and you get it on a 10-second snippet on Target. Not only are you getting residuals for that song every time it plays for years to come, especially if it's international, you know, your music is getting out there on a higher platform that isn't as saturated when it comes to $1 million marketing plans that are supported by labels or distribution companies, which even then, sometimes artists who are signed like that can get put on a back burner regardless of the marketing money that goes behind it. But I think it's much easier to get through the saturation of being heard and being paid through TV and sync.
Wow. I think that's really important to hear, because it's not necessarily on a lot of creators' radar. They think, oh, I need to get my streams. Oh, I need to be on radio, and not really thinking about these non-traditional kind of sync opportunities that are going to be a lot more lucrative. So I think that that's something to really kind of put in your arsenal and say, all right, when I'm putting things out, this is where I will put them out in the universe. So we are at our time. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being SONA's ambassador for the month. I want to thank you for joining us today and all of your passion and insights. Liana, as always, you are our rock star in guiding these conversations. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for the space that you create to have these conversations. Everyone who is watching, thank you for joining us today. We
Yeah.
we had a good audience today. And if you're watching this on the replay,
The Latinas are showing up.
yes, thank you for our replay. Feel free, don't be shy to jump in the chat and the comments of the replay. And I do want to remind everybody that we do like to end these with calls to action. We don't want you to sit here and just listen and not take anything away. And so a lot of things that Jesaiah and Liana talked about today were about making different choices, about educating yourself, celebrating yourself. So when we're talking about choices, making musical choices in your writing and your production and your listening, that raises the bar for everyone. When we're talking about how we speak about each other, how we spread love, how we view each other, how we mesh genres and unite as a global music family, think about those choices in the songwriting community. Educate yourself. Educate yourself on the identities. We started at the very beginning of the conversation about who or what or where is included in Latin or Hispanic heritage. So really make sure that we educate ourselves when we think about these things. And last but not least, celebrate yourself. Celebrate you and yourself and your heritage unapologetically, no matter where you were raised, no matter whether Spanish is your first language or you learned it late in life, or you sound like me and you're a gringo. Celebrate yourself, celebrate your heritage, and do it unapologetically. Those are our calls to action today from our fireside chat. And most importantly, I can't leave without telling you, if you are not a member of SONA, please go to wearesona.com and click join. And if you would like to support, you can also click donate to support the movement. We will also drop the chat in the description box and the link here for Zoom. On behalf of myself and my co-chair Mandy and all of SONA, thank you all for your time this afternoon. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.